New York, 1897. The streets of Lower Manhattan's Italian Quarter swarmed with the clatter of horse-drawn carts and the cries of street vendors. In a dimly lit tenement, a small shopkeeper unfolded a note, the edges darkened with what looked unmistakably like blood. The words were simple, chilling. "Pay $100, or death comes to your door tonight." The Black Hand had struck again. Extortion, arson, and even kidnapping had become the currency of fear in Little Italy. Families whispered of neighbors who vanished overnight, their livelihoods burned or seized, and no one dared appeal to the police. The law, they believed, could not, or would not, protect them. Amid the chaos, one man stood apart: Joseph Petrosino. Born in Palermo, Sicily, and raised in New York, he had risen through the ranks of the NYPD, his courage and tenacity earning him both medals and enemies. Petrosino was the first Italian-American detective in a department wary of immigrants, a man whose understanding of his community's language, culture, and fears made him uniquely suited to confront the shadow that haunted the streets. The task before him was unprecedented. The Black Hand was not a gang with a headquarters. It was a network of terror, stretching from the tenements of Manhattan to the hills of Sicily. Letters soaked in blood, masked threats, and violent reprisals demanded a response, but the tools at Petrosino's disposal were rudimentary. No telephones, no fingerprints, no coordinated federal oversight. Intelligence relied on informants, observation, and intuition. As the Black Hand's grip tightened, Joseph Petrosino became a symbol of hope and resistance. He would assemble a team, track criminals across city blocks and continents, and confront an enemy that existed both in the shadows of the streets and in the minds of the terrified immigrant families. His story is one of courage, strategy, and sacrifice, a battle at the dawn of organized crime in America. Joseph Petrosino was born on August 30, 1860 in Padula, a small town in the Campania region of southern Italy. His father, Luigi, worked as a municipal clerk, and his mother, Rosa, managed the household and family affairs. The town was modest, its streets lined with stone houses, narrow alleys, and the occasional market where local farmers sold produce. Life in southern Italy was difficult, opportunities were limited, and emigration promised a chance at better prospects. In 1873, when Joseph was 12, the Petrosino family immigrated to the United States, joining a wave of southern Italians seeking work and stability. They settled initially in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a dense enclave of tenements, shops, and ethnic networks. The neighborhood teemed with Italian immigrants adjusting to life in a city that was as unforgiving as it was full of promise. Children worked in workshops, factories, and street markets. Crowded conditions, disease, and poverty were everyday challenges. Italian immigrants were often stigmatized, facing prejudice from other communities and suspicion from authorities. Joseph learned early to observe human behavior, discern threats, and navigate a world where survival demanded both caution and initiative. At age 23 in 1883, Joseph Petrosino joined the New York Police Department. The NYPD of the late 19th century was politically influenced and organizationally complex. Political corruption persisted in precincts, and officers often contended with favoritism and patronage. Despite these obstacles, Petrosino earned recognition for his discipline, intelligence, and dedication to the Italian-American community. He quickly distinguished himself among colleagues for his vigilance and courage. Petrosino's early work focused on neighborhood-level policing, including addressing petty crime, street violence, and extortion affecting Italian immigrants. He developed skills in observation, investigation, and discreet intelligence gathering, particularly within the Italian-American community. His fluency in Italian and knowledge of local customs allowed him to communicate with immigrants in ways other officers could not. During the 1880s and 1890s, Petrosino also honed physical skills that would later become crucial in confrontations with criminals. Reports from the era indicate he trained rigorously in hand-to-hand combat, frequently engaging in arrests that required both skill and restraint. He learned to subdue suspects without unnecessary injury, a trait noted in contemporary police records and newspaper accounts. Mentorship played a significant role in shaping Petrosino's approach to policing. He developed working relationships with senior officers who valued his linguistic and cultural expertise. Additionally, leaders in the Italian-American community, including clergy and business owners, provided guidance and information, helping him navigate networks of influence and maintain community trust. By the late 1890s, Petrosino had established a reputation as a methodical and committed detective. While many officers relied on routine patrols and standard reporting, he emphasized information gathering, pattern recognition, and preventive action. His innovative approach to policing Italian immigrant neighborhoods foreshadowed the special investigations he would later conduct against organized criminal elements such as the Black Hand. Petrosino operated in a time when forensic science was rudimentary and investigative tools were limited. Fingerprinting was in its infancy, and systematic crime labs did not exist. Detectives relied on careful observation, eyewitness accounts, and community networks. Petrosino's understanding of these limitations informed his methods. He cultivated trusted sources, leveraged cultural knowledge, and conducted surveillance with patience and discretion. By 1900, Joseph Petrosino was no ordinary patrol officer. He had combined linguistic skill, cultural insight, physical ability, and investigative rigor into a unique detective profile. He was increasingly recognized for his ability to handle delicate cases involving Italian immigrants, extortion, and emerging organized crime networks. His early career laid the groundwork for the specialized role he would soon assume, bridging law enforcement and the immigrant community, and setting the stage for his fight against the Black Hand, a fight that would take him from New York streets to Sicily itself. By the early 1900s, New York City's Italian immigrant neighborhoods were rife with fear and uncertainty. The Lower East Side and East Harlem teemed with families who had recently arrived from southern Italy. They spoke in dialects unfamiliar to most police officers, navigated crowded tenements and narrow streets, and operated small businesses, bakeries, laundries, fruit stands, that were easy targets for extortion. The term Black Hand first appeared in New York newspapers around 1903. It did not describe a single criminal organization but rather a method: extortion through threats, intimidation, and occasionally violence. Letters marked with handprints, inked or stamped, demanded payment in return for safety. The handwriting style and tone varied from case to case, reflecting the decentralized nature of the crime. While some perpetrators were connected to Sicilian Mafia networks, most were independent extortionists exploiting immigrants' fear and isolation. Opera tenor. Enrico Caruso's case exemplifies the climate. In 1906, Caruso received letters threatening harm unless he paid a ransom. Though a high-profile example, Caruso was far from unique. Many immigrants and small business owners quietly complied to protect their families, often at great personal expense. Black Hand activity included threats of arson, physical harm, and kidnapping, though the execution of these threats varied. Many letters were designed to terrorize, relying more on fear than on actual violence. Law enforcement struggled to respond. The NYPD in the early 1900s lacked the resources, linguistic capacity, and organizational structures to address these crimes effectively. Officers were often unfamiliar with Italian dialects and customs, which made interviewing victims or following leads difficult. Political corruption further hampered investigations, and many precincts dismissed Black Hand complaints as minor ethnic disputes rather than serious crimes. Inspectors in the Postal Service were sometimes more effective, tracing letters and investigating mail-based threats, but coordination across agencies was limited. Joseph Petrosino, promoted to sergeant detective in 1895 under Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, began to stand out during this period. His fluency in Italian and Neapolitan dialects allowed him to communicate with victims and witnesses in ways most officers could not. He gained recognition for his diligence in investigating extortion, kidnapping, and related crimes, carefully documenting reports and identifying recurring suspects. Petrosino did not yet command the Italian squad. That specialized unit would not be established until 1904. Still, his early work laid the foundation for more systematic policing of these crimes. In these years, Petrosino developed intelligence-gathering methods that were innovative for their time. He cataloged letters, observed neighborhoods, and cultivated discrete networks of informants within immigrant communities. He noted patterns, common handwriting features, recurring threats, and locations where extortion payments were delivered. These observations were piecemeal but invaluable, allowing him to anticipate where and how Black Hand activity might occur. The effects of Black Hand threats were tangible. Shopkeepers carried cash with care, sometimes hiding it in attics or secret compartments. Families avoided confrontations, and many refrained from reporting crimes to police, fearing retaliation or prejudice. Business owners altered their routines, closing shops early or arranging meetings in public to pay ransoms. The social fabric of Italian neighborhoods was strained. Trust eroded under the pressure of unseen extortionists. Although some press accounts of the Black Hand sensationalized events, reporters often implied a centralized mafia conspiracy where none existed, the danger was real. Extortion letters were concrete instruments of fear. Surveillance by ordinary citizens and local clergy became an unofficial supplement to police work. Petrosino leveraged this community knowledge, documenting reported threats and assisting victims in discreet ways, gradually establishing a reputation for fairness, discretion, and effectiveness. By 1905, Black Hand crimes had become a persistent concern for New York authorities. While individual gangs operated independently, the cumulative effect created a pervasive climate of fear and economic disruption. Petrosino's early investigations did not yet reveal a fully coordinated network or international criminal enterprise. He understood only that the criminals were exploiting a combination of immigrant isolation, fear of authority, and limited policing resources. His efforts were methodical. Careful observation, linguistic proficiency, and detailed record-keeping formed the core of his strategy. In this period, Petrosino's work highlighted both the limitations of contemporary law enforcement and the potential for intelligence-led policing. He began to build relationships with community leaders, clergy, and local business owners. Through discreet interviews, note-taking, and persistent investigation, he could track suspected extortionists, identify patterns, and prepare cases that would eventually support arrests and prosecutions. His early successes set the stage for the Italian squad, which, once formed, would focus directly on the threat posed by the Black Hand and related organized crime elements. By 1905, the term Black Hand had entered public consciousness. Newspapers described threatening letters, occasionally sensationalizing them as tools of a grand criminal conspiracy. For Italian immigrants, however, the phenomenon was personal and immediate, a shadow over daily life, a test of courage and a source of constant anxiety. Petrosino's work during these years, careful, methodical, and often invisible, began to bridge the gap between fearful communities and an unprepared police force, marking him as one of the first law enforcement officers to specialize in crimes against Italian immigrants and to systematically gather intelligence against extortionists using the Black Hand method. By 1906, Joseph Petrosino's reputation within the New York Police Department had reached a point few could ignore. His meticulous work tracking Black Hand extortion, combined with his fluency in Italian and Neapolitan dialects, made him uniquely positioned to confront a problem that standard policing could not penetrate. That year, the NYPD formally authorized the creation of the Italian Squad, a specialized unit under Petrosino's command. The squad's mandate was clear: investigate crimes that disproportionately affected Italian immigrants, including extortion, counterfeiting, and kidnapping threats. The squad's composition reflected both necessity and strategy. Officers were recruited for language skills, cultural familiarity, and prior experience with investigative work. Bilingual detectives could enter tenements and bakeries, speak directly with victims, and coax information from witnesses who would otherwise remain silent. Petrosino insisted on careful vetting. Loyalty was critical in a force susceptible to corruption and bribery. The unit was small, typically fewer than a dozen officers, but its members operated with an intensity and discretion unmatched elsewhere in the department. Methods developed by Petrosino combined emerging intelligence techniques with the practical realities of early 20th century policing. Surveillance was conducted on foot, often for hours or days, observing suspects' movements through crowded streets and tenement courtyards. Informants, frequently individuals within the community who had experienced threats firsthand, provided tips on where letters were being sent, where extortion payments were being collected, and which establishments served as informal Black Hand headquarters. Officers analyzed the extortion letters themselves, comparing handwriting, paper quality, and phrasing to identify patterns across multiple cases. Petrosino maintained meticulous records, cataloging details of each threat, payment, and suspect, creating a proto-database decades before digital records would exist. One of the squad's early achievements involved the identification of multiple extortionists operating along Mulberry Street and nearby blocks. Petrosino and his officers followed suspects on foot, sometimes tailing them through crowded pushcart markets and narrow alleyways, observing the transfer of cash from terrified shopkeepers. By connecting letter characteristics to local operatives, the squad could predict which families or businesses were likely targets next. While arrests were not always immediate, the intelligence gathered allowed the NYPD to intervene more effectively than before. Raids on suspected black hand dens became an increasingly common tactic. Petrosino coordinated operations with precision, timing interventions to maximize the chance of catching extortionists in the act. Officers would quietly surround buildings at night, enter swiftly, and seize letters, documents, and occasionally weapons. Though early forensic tools were limited, fingerprinting was in its infancy, telephones were scarce, and photography was cumbersome. Careful observation and documentation often sufficed to support prosecutions. Evidence was compiled in detailed reports, including copies of extortion letters and lists of threatened businesses. Community response to the Italian squad was cautiously positive. Immigrant families who had previously been reluctant to involve police began to report threats. Petrosino emphasized discretion. Victims' identities were protected whenever possible, and officers took care not to inflame tensions or expose families to retaliation. Slowly, a sense of deterrence emerged. Extortionists, once confident that fear alone would secure compliance, realized their actions could now prompt swift investigation and arrest. Letters demanding ransom were intercepted more frequently, and organized black hand activity became riskier. Challenges persisted. The NYPD itself was not immune to political interference. Officers faced pressure to avoid high-profile cases that might disrupt relationships with local politicians or influential community leaders. Coordination with federal authorities was minimal. The notion of organized crime as a transnational phenomenon had not yet taken hold, and agencies such as the U.S. Postal Service or early federal investigators operated largely in isolation. Petrosino's squad adapted, relying on surveillance, informants, and careful analysis of physical evidence rather than technology, which was rudimentary at best. Despite limitations, the squad achieved measurable success. Known extortionists were arrested and, in some cases, convicted, while others fled or abandoned their operations in New York. Petrosino's careful documentation created a record that allowed patterns of criminal activity to be understood across neighborhoods. Letters, once seen as isolated incidents of intimidation, were now traceable to individual actors or small networks. This intelligence-driven approach laid the groundwork for future investigations, not only against local extortionists, but eventually against Mafia-affiliated operatives who would emerge in later decades. Petrosino's leadership was central to the squad's effectiveness. He led by example, often personally following suspects or reviewing intelligence late into the night. His knowledge of immigrant communities, combined with a disciplined approach to investigation, created both fear and respect. Officers were motivated by his dedication and his insistence on precision. By 1908, the Italian squad had established a reputation within the city. Criminals knew that extortion against Italian immigrants would not go unchallenged, and communities began to regain a measure of trust in law enforcement. Yet the work was perilous. Informants risked retaliation, officers were vulnerable to attack during foot surveillance, and black hand operatives occasionally resorted to arson or violent threats against those who cooperated with police. Every intercepted letter, every calculated raid, represented both a tactical success and a potential flashpoint for violence. Petrosino's careful balancing of aggressive investigation and community protection was a hallmark of the squad's operations. By the end of 1908, the Italian squad had become a model for targeted law enforcement. It demonstrated the value of culturally informed policing, intelligence gathering, and strategic intervention. Petrosino had not yet faced the full scope of the Mafia's international networks, but he had created a foundation for confronting organized crime among Italian immigrants in New York. Letters of threat still arrived, but fewer victims were willing to pay, and the streets of Little Italy began to show signs that calculated law enforcement could stand against fear and intimidation. The squad's work did not eradicate Black Hand activity, nor did it dissolve extortion entirely. Yet for the first time, a disciplined, intelligence-driven approach offered a measure of protection to a community long preyed upon by criminals. Petrosino had taken the first critical step toward confronting organized crime on both local and, eventually, international scales. Every intercepted letter, every cautious interview, and every well-timed raid contributed to a growing sense that the law could, in fact, protect those who previously had nowhere to turn. By 1908, Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino had become one of the most recognizable faces in the New York Police Department. The Italian squad, his creation, had made real inroads against Black Hand extortionists who preyed on the city's immigrant poor. Dozens of arrests, countless threats intercepted, and a growing sense that the law could finally protect Little Italy. Yet Petrosino knew he was only fighting symptoms. The disease ran deeper, across an ocean. Most of the extortionists he arrested had roots in southern Italy or Sicily. Many used the same methods: letters marked with crude black handprints, threats of dynamite or kidnapping, and demands for small sums, $50, $100, from terrified laborers and merchants. Once arrested, they often had connections, family or otherwise, back in Sicily, where criminal influence had already coalesced under the networks that Italians quietly called La Mafia. Petrosino's growing suspicion was simple and profound. These crimes were not isolated acts of desperation, but the exported habits of a criminal subculture thriving on both sides of the Atlantic. He began collecting fragments of intelligence, informant whispers, police reports, names scribbled in ledgers. None of it suggested a single conspiracy, but patterns were emerging. Some of the men deported from New York returned within months. Others sent money orders to Palermo or Naples. It wasn't proof, but it was movement. And movement, Petrosino knew, was the key to understanding any criminal system. By late 1908, he was convinced that New York's fight against the Black Hand had to extend to Italy itself. His proposal was bold: a personal mission to Italy to exchange intelligence with local authorities and build a cooperative effort to identify known criminals before they set foot in the United States. It was an unprecedented idea for an NYPD detective, transnational policing decades before such concepts were formally recognized. Commissioner Theodore Bingham approved the plan. Officially, Petrosino was to travel under diplomatic secrecy. His assignment: deliver dossiers on hundreds of Italian nationals suspected of serious crimes in New York, request Italian cooperation, and investigate the possibility of extraditing certain fugitives. Unofficially, he would meet with trusted Sicilian officials and seek confirmation that Mafia-linked figures were orchestrating or facilitating extortion rings in the United States. The plan's success depended entirely on discretion. Petrosino prepared carefully, organizing case files, background notes, and correspondence that outlined years of NYPD investigation. He traveled light, relying on trusted informants for updates and on his reputation for diligence to open doors overseas. But within days, the most important element of his mission, its secrecy, was destroyed. On February 20th, 1909, New York newspapers ran headlines revealing Petrosino's departure and his purpose. The source of the leak was staggering: Police Commissioner Bingham himself. In a public attempt to bolster his department's reputation, Bingham boasted that the NYPD was sending its best detective to Italy to root out criminals at their source. To the reading public, it was a story of heroism. To the criminals who followed the news from Naples to Palermo, it was a death sentence in print. Petrosino sailed for Europe aboard the Duca di Genova in early February. Whether he read the news reports before departing is uncertain, but by the time he reached Genoa, the story had circulated across Italy. Criminals knew he was coming, and some in Sicily began to prepare. Arriving in Rome, Petrosino met with American diplomatic staff and representatives of the Italian Ministry of the Interior. The atmosphere was cordial but cautious. Italy's government was acutely aware of Mafia influence, yet wary of outside interference. Petrosino pressed his case, arguing that coordinated intelligence could prevent criminals from crossing to America under assumed names. He presented his files, painstakingly assembled lists of known offenders, mugshots, and background data, to officials who promised to distribute them to local police. From Rome, he traveled south to Palermo. The city was both beautiful and menacing, a place where the law was unevenly applied and power often lay in the hands of local bosses rather than magistrates. Petrosino checked into the Hotel de France under his own name, perhaps trusting his official mission and diplomatic contacts to provide protection. He began meeting quietly with local informants and police officers. His questions were simple but dangerous. Who were the men sending money from America? Who received them in Sicily? What families controlled the port towns where these travelers landed? Each conversation brought him closer to understanding how the patterns overlapped, how local mafiosi acted as brokers or guarantors for immigrants who continued criminal activity abroad. The work was methodical and perilous. Petrosino moved through Palermo's narrow streets, often alone, recording notes and sending letters back to New York through consular channels. He knew his time was limited. The press in both Italy and America had made him famous, and fame was poison for a detective in hostile territory. His reputation as the Italian Sherlock Holmes inspired immigrants in New York, but in Palermo, it made him a marked man. The very people he sought to expose knew his face, his mission, and his movements. On the evening of March 12, 1909, Petrosino left his hotel for what was likely a meeting with an informant near Piazza Marina. He carried documents, though the nature of the meeting remains uncertain. The following morning, before dawn, passers-by discovered his body sprawled in the square. 4 bullets had struck him, 1 to the head, 3 to the body. His wallet and watch remained untouched. It was not robbery. It was assassination. News of his death spread quickly, first through Sicily, then across the Atlantic. In New York, flags were lowered to half-staff at police precincts. Immigrants wept openly in the streets of Mulberry Bend. Thousands attended his funeral, which became one of the largest in NYPD history. The investigation in Italy identified several suspects but produced no convictions. Whether his killers acted on local orders or at the behest of those in America remains unknown. The prevailing theory among historians is that Sicilian mafiosi, aware of his mission and fearing renewed cooperation with American authorities, ordered his death. In the aftermath, Petrosino's files, his notes, lists, and intelligence reports were returned to New York. They revealed no single grand conspiracy, but instead a complex web of criminal migration, opportunism, and silence. What Petrosino had glimpsed was not a singular Black Hand organization, but the fluid beginnings of transnational organized crime, a network of individuals and families exploiting the same vulnerabilities on both continents. Petrosino's assassination marked both an ending and a beginning. It ended the first serious attempt by an American lawman to confront the Sicilian criminal underworld at its source. But it also began a new era of awareness. Law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic recognized that crime could not be contained by geography, language, or national law. His mission, undone by the very publicity meant to honor it, became a cautionary tale in the history of policing. The leak that sealed his fate underscored the delicate balance between politics, press, and operational secrecy. For all his precision and foresight, Petrosino could not control what he left behind: a public eager for heroes, and enemies who always read the papers. The telegram reached New York in the first days of March 1909. It came from Palermo, Italy, blunt, official, and devastating. Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino was dead. He had been shot 4 times in the Piazza Marina. His body was found beneath a lamppost, his spectacles still in his hand, his revolver untouched. The man who had chased extortionists through the alleys of Little Italy lay murdered on the soil of his birth. The news spread like fire through the tenements. In Mulberry Bend and Mott Street, people stood frozen in the doorways of bakeries and barber shops. Petrosino had been more than a policeman. To many Italian immigrants, he was proof that one of their own could wear the city's badge with honor. Women wept in the street. Men cursed in dialects from Sicily to Calabria. Fear hung thick in the air. If even he could be killed, What safety was left for the rest? When the coffin arrived in New York, the city stopped. Over 200,000 mourners filled the streets for his funeral procession. The police draped their badges in black cloth. Shop fronts along Mulberry Street shuddered in respect. Inside St. Patrick's Cathedral, the air was heavy with incense and grief. The New York Times called him the bravest detective in the history of the department. Other papers named him the Italian Sherlock Holmes, a romantic label born not from his lifetime, but from his death, a symbol the press invented to explain a man whose work defied easy definition. In Palermo, the Italian authorities launched an inquiry, but it faltered almost immediately. A handful of witnesses came forward, dock workers, a coachman, a woman who had heard gunfire from a window. But their statements conflicted, and within days most had vanished or recanted. Fear did the rest. Investigators encountered a wall of silence. Files were misplaced, evidence mishandled, and rumors spread faster than facts. The Mafia's influence in the Sicilian police and courts ensured that no suspect ever stood trial. Across the Atlantic, the assassination sent shockwaves through the NYPD. The Italian squad, the unit Petrosino had built with his own hands, was left reeling. Commissioner Bingham, whose ill-timed public announcement had revealed Petrosino's mission before his ship even docked in Palermo, faced sharp criticism. Officers whispered about betrayal, not from criminals, but from the department itself. Petrosino's empty desk became a shrine, covered in photographs and letters. His case files, marked in his tight handwriting, were sealed and stored as if sacred. The public outrage was fierce but short-lived. By the following year, city politics had moved on, and reform came slower than anyone hoped. The black hand letters did not stop. Bakers, grocers, and fruit vendors continued to find threats in their mail, shaky handwriting, black ink handprints, and demands for money. Without Petrosino's leadership, coordination between precincts faltered. Corruption, language barriers, and prejudice still undermined police response. Yet his death also lit a spark that did not go out. Young Italian-American officers joined the force, inspired by his example. They spoke the language of the neighborhoods, knew their rhythms and fears, and began quietly gathering intelligence in his style, small notebooks filled with names, addresses, and whispered rumors. It was slow, dangerous work, but it carried his imprint. Civic organizations rose in parallel. Mutual aid societies and parish committees began collecting information about extortionists, sharing it with trusted officers. Newspapers printed editorials urging the Italian community to speak without fear, though fear remained the one constant. Still, over the next several years, these grassroots efforts and continued police pressure began to thin the ranks of the most violent extortionists. Institutional change came gradually. By the mid-1910s, the NYPD had begun standardizing criminal records and improving interagency cooperation. The department developed early systems for intelligence sharing between precincts, a practice that had started with Petrosino's handwritten dossiers. His methods of mapping social ties and monitoring coded correspondence became the framework for modern detective work. But the cost was visible. Between 1909 and 1915, violence within Italian neighborhoods spiked. The assassination of Petrosino had emboldened some criminals, at least temporarily. Several detectives who followed his path met similar fates, ambushed or intimidated into silence. Only with the combined weight of persistent policing and growing community resistance did the tide begin to turn. As decades passed, Petrosino's story grew beyond the facts. In print, he was transformed into legend, the immigrant hero who fought both the criminals and the corrupt system that ignored them. Plays, dime novels, and later radio dramatizations cast him as a fearless lone avenger. Films in the 1930s and 1940s carried his name to a new generation, often blurring truth and myth until the man himself was obscured by the narrative. But among detectives, the myth carried a practical legacy. His work became a cornerstone of intelligence-led policing. Petrosino's emphasis on surveillance, undercover infiltration, and cultural fluency, ideas that were revolutionary for his time, would later guide federal investigations into organized crime during Prohibition and beyond. The first serious federal campaigns against Mafia operations in the 1920s, drew heavily from Petrosino's model of cross-agency coordination and data-driven pursuit. In Italy, his death remained a national scar. Palermo newspapers called the assassination una ferita aperta, an open wound. The city eventually erected a memorial in Piazza Marina, near the site where he fell. To this day, wreaths are laid there by both Italian and American police officers, a quiet annual gesture that bridges continents. Back in New York, Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino Square still stands where the old Mulberry Bend once twisted through the heart of Little Italy. His statue looks outward, across a city he helped reshape. For the immigrants who arrived after his time, his name became shorthand for courage and integrity, a symbol that one of their own had earned honor through service, not fear. Petrosino's lessons outlived the century. His belief that crime thrived in silence and secrecy led to a new philosophy of policing: community trust as intelligence. His insistence that language, culture, and empathy were tools of investigation anticipated what modern criminology now takes for granted. And his understanding that organized crime ignored borders foreshadowed the very nature of transnational criminal networks that law enforcement faces today. More than a century later, the echoes of his work remain. When agencies coordinate across countries to dismantle human trafficking rings or financial cartels, they echo Petrosino's vision. His death, tragic as it was, forced both the United States and Italy to acknowledge that criminal enterprise was not confined to one neighborhood or one nation. And yet, the most enduring lesson of his story may be its humility. Petrosino did not imagine himself a hero. He once wrote in a private note, found after his death, "A detective must stand between two worlds, one of law, one of shadows. If he cannot speak both languages, he can serve neither." That line captures the essence of his legacy, not glory, but duty. A century later, every detective who studies his case learns the same truth. That courage alone is not enough. Intelligence, patience, and empathy are the weapons that endure. Joseph Petrosino's body was buried in Calvary Cemetery, but his work did not die with him. It became the foundation of something larger, a bridge between nations, between communities and the law, between what crime was and what justice could become. His story began in the alleyways of Little Italy and continues wherever the pursuit of truth crosses a border.